right, I have 6 o'clock on my watch, so let's get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jeff Belanger. I'm the Director of the Manchester Planning and Community Development Department, and I want to welcome all of you to this presentation about the second draft of the proposed Manchester zoning ordinance. It's been a little more than a year since this first draft of this ordinance was published in June of 2024, and I and the other members of the planning staff have been pretty busy since then. And so the goal of tonight's presentation is to get everybody up to speed on what we've been up to, and to talk about what's in the proposed second draft of the zoning ordinance, and to talk about the process for bringing it forward to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen for adoption. But before we get into the presentation, I'd just like to introduce the folks who are up here with me tonight. Sitting directly to my right is Kristen Bixby. This zoning ordinance is the product of thousands of hours of work from many members of the planning staff, but no one has put in more hours than Kristen. She is the project manager. She is a senior planner in our office. And when I came back from the Board of Mayor and Alderman meeting at around 10 o'clock on Tuesday night to the planning department, she was still there diligently working at her desk on this. So I appreciate all of her hard work, and I appreciate her being here tonight. And next to her is Mike Landry. Mike is the Deputy Director of Building Regulations for the planning department. He is an attorney and an engineer by training, and he is in charge of, among other things, the Zoning Board of Adjustment staffing and also code enforcement. So Mike's experience and expertise has been incredibly helpful in the drafting of this document. Next to Mike is Rosa Marcos. Rosa is a planner in our office. She is an architect and an urban designer by training, and so anything that looks good in this zoning ordinance is definitely a result of her work. We appreciate that, and she has also lent her considerable expertise in design theory in general, and for a document that relies so much on design as this one does, her skills and experience have been incredibly helpful. And so there are other members of the planning department who cannot be here tonight, but all of them have worked hard on this document. They have worked nights, they have worked weekends. It has been a labor of love for all of us, and we are very pleased to present it all to you tonight. And so with that, Rosa, would you mind just dimming the lights a little bit so folks can see the screen a little better? Okay, so up on the screen is an outline of what we will be talking about tonight. We're going to begin with the most important aspect of writing the proposed zoning ordinance, which was asking Manchester's citizens to tell us what they thought about the first draft and what they wanted for the future of their city. The most important goal for me and for all of the planning staff when it comes to this zoning ordinance is to ensure that it reflects the will of the people of Manchester, and so we did everything we could to engage with people and to learn what they wanted. The next thing we're going to talk about are the results of that public engagement. I will describe the data that we got from thousands of public comments and what themes emerged from that data. And third, we will talk about how we responded to all of the information we got by incorporating what people told us into the zoning ordinance to create the second draft. The touchstone for our edits was always what we learned from that public engagement. Fourth, we will talk about the plan for adoption of the zoning ordinance by the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. This will include a period of public comment and a number of meetings with the board. And fifth, if there are any questions, I and the other members of staff would be happy to try to answer them. I want to note at the outset that this is going to be a lengthy presentation. It's going to take at least an hour. There's a lot to talk about, and I want to err on the side of over-communication because this is an important document that affects the whole city. And because I know that not everyone has an hour to devote to zoning, I want to say in one slide, right at the beginning, what the expected benefits of the proposed zoning ordinance are intended to be. As I'm going to describe, the people of Manchester told us what they wanted with this new zoning ordinance, and those of us who worked on the ordinance have done our best to create a document that can help deliver on these things. I want to note that the title of the slide is Expected Contributions of the Proposed Zoning Ordinance. What I mean by that is that there is no zoning ordinance that could ever entirely address all of the topics on this list. Each of them is complicated with many factors that influence it. What we believe the zoning ordinance can do, though, is contribute to moving each of these things in a positive direction, and specifically in the direction that the people of Manchester want it to go. So the first is helping to make housing more affordable. There are many factors that contribute to the cost of housing, like the cost of labor and the cost of materials, but zoning can play a role because zoning influences housing supply, and as we all know, it is the relationship between supply and demand that determines price. The second thing that is on the list is maintaining community character. The proposed zoning ordinance has a lot of tools that the current zoning ordinance does not to ensure that buildings and new uses fit in with their surroundings. The proposed zoning ordinance would help maintain the look and feel of Manchester that so many of us have come to appreciate, and would add a number of small things to help improve quality of life in the city. The third thing is making it easier to establish small businesses in more areas of the city. This is something that a lot of people told us they wanted, and so the zoning ordinance attempts to do that, but in an incremental way that is comfortable for current neighborhoods. The next goal is to help increase the walkability of the city. There are some aspects of walkability that are beyond the reach of zoning, like the prevalence and maintenance of sidewalks, but zoning can play a role by establishing design criteria that make buildings more appealing to walk next to, and allowing small-scale convenience businesses in more places so that people can get some of what they need on foot rather than in a car. The the proposed zoning ordinance would strengthen the protections of historic places and natural resources in the city. This was something that got high levels of support from the public. People told us that they really care about both of these things, so we attempted to find ways to preserve both without stifling important economic activity and construction. And to me, the most important benefit on this list is at the bottom. The top of the goal of the planning staff from the beginning of writing this ordinance has been to make it a reflection of what the people of Manchester want for their city. As you will see in this presentation, we conducted a robust process of public engagement during the summer of 2024 with the goal of finding out what people wanted this proposed zoning ordinance to do. And then we did everything we could to write a zoning ordinance that delivered on what people wanted. For all of the people who gave their time and attended a community meeting or took a survey and wrote us comments, I want to say we heard you, we took your comments seriously, and the proposed zoning ordinance reflects them. And so with that, there's just one more thing that I want to mention before getting into the presentation, and that is where to find the proposed zoning ordinance. The best place to find it is on our website, which is www.manchesternh.gov/land-use-code. It's probably easiest to just Google Manchester Land Use Code. The first item that comes up should be the website. And this is the front page for the website of the proposed zoning ordinance. The first thing under the welcome language is announcements, and the top announcement is the publication of the second draft of the proposed zoning ordinance that is shown next to the red arrow on the screen. And there is a link there to download the second draft, and there are many other resources on this website. For instance, there is a link to the presentation that I gave a year ago in this room when we published the first draft of the proposed zoning ordinance. That presentation was intended to give a lot of background about zoning, such as what zoning is, Manchester's history with zoning, and importantly, how the City of Manchester had recently adopted a new master plan and the direction that the master plan directed the staff to write a new zoning ordinance, which is why we created the first draft. This presentation also has lots of information about the first draft, and it walked through the zoning ordinance chapter by chapter to describe what is in it and how to use it. And just like this presentation, that presentation was recorded by Manchester Public Television. And I really did not think that many people would be interested in a lengthy presentation about zoning, but for the past year, it has been the most frequently watched recording on Manchester Public Television. I think that indicates the level of interest that people have in this topic. And there are many other resources on the website that anyone can access to learn more about the zoning ordinance, and you can find them by clicking on the Resources tab. When you do, you will see a long list of different documents that can be helpful for understanding the proposed zoning ordinance. These include brief, 2-page descriptions of each zoning district, which look like this. They all have a painting that shows the character of the district. They describe a lot of different things about each district, such as the uses that are allowed and the minimum lot sizes and the setbacks. And we also have a lengthy list of maps that people can access on the resources page. For instance, we have a series of 3 maps for each ward of the city. These maps show the current zoning districts, which is the map on the left, the proposed zoning districts, which is the map in the middle, and the current zoning districts laid on top of the proposed zoning districts, which is on the right. The map on the right is helpful to show where zoning districts would have different boundaries from what they are today. We also have land use maps for each ward of the city. These maps show different land uses that are currently happening within each ward, meaning how different properties are used today. Each color on the map denotes a different land use. So for instance, white means single-family homes, beige means duplexes, and orange means multifamily buildings. There are legends on each map that describe what each color means. And these maps are useful for understanding what is actually going on within a certain area of the city and how the uses within that area do or do not match up with current zoning. Each ward has 2 maps like this. One map, like this one, shows the boundaries of the current zoning districts, and the other map, like this one, shows the boundaries of the proposed zoning districts. The reason for having both current and proposed districts shown with the current land uses is so that people can see how the proposed zoning ordinance would better match up with what is actually being built. There are many parcels in Manchester that do not conform to the current zoning, and so the proposed zoning ordinance would update the districts to bring more of these lots into legal conformity. There are many more documents on the website that should be helpful for anyone who wants to know more about the proposed zoning ordinance, and I encourage anyone who wants to go check them out. Okay, so now let's talk about the first main topic of tonight's presentation, which is the process of public engagement that began after the publication of the first draft of the proposed zoning ordinance on June 21st of 2024. The goals with this process were to make as many people as possible aware that a new zoning ordinance was being proposed, and most importantly, to learn what people thought about how the city should develop in the future. The process began just a few days after the publication of the first draft. In early July, a letter from Mayor Rouet went to every household in the city, which was more than 56,000 in total. That letter did two important things. First, it informed people of the days, times, and locations of 12 community meetings that would be held to talk about the proposed zoning ordinance. There are 12 wards in the city of Manchester, and we wanted to go to each one of them to meet with people in locations that were convenient to them and to hold the meetings on both weekday evenings and during the day on weekdays so that people could find a day and time that worked for them. The purpose of these meetings was to explain to people what the zoning ordinance proposed and, most importantly, to get their comments on what they thought about it. The second thing the letter did was tell people about a survey that they could take to have input on the new zoning ordinance. People could take the survey simply by scanning the QR code that was in the letter, or by going to a website, or by filling it out on paper. The letter arrived in most people's mailboxes on July 8th, and the survey was available for people to take on the same day. It was up and available for 2 months until September 8th. That letter was probably the most effective thing that we did to make people aware of the proposed zoning ordinance, the meetings, and the survey, but it was not the only thing. In addition to the letter, Mayor Rouet also recorded a radio announcement that ran on the Manchester Media Group stations, which are WZID, WFEA, and Live Free Country. This is a transcript of the announcement. As you can see, the message made people aware of how they could participate in the survey and the community meetings and directed them to the zoning ordinance's website. We also sent out many Nixle alerts, including for the publication of the zoning ordinance and for each of the 12 community meetings. Nixle is a free messaging system that is used by the city and people can sign up for it and learn about what is going on in Manchester. There are approximately 12,000 people who subscribe to the city's Nixle alerts, and they can get them both on their computer and on their phones. We also put up announcements on the city's website, and we had articles in the city's economic development newsletter. We also took out a quarter-page ad in the Union Leader to tell people about the meetings and the survey and to direct them to the website, and we got a banner ad in Manchester Inklink. The main goal of all of this publicity was to make people aware of the opportunities that they had to learn about the ordinance and comment on it. They could always comment through the website, but the two most informative and interactive ways for people to learn about the ordinance and to comment on it were the community meetings and the survey. And we wanted to get as many people as possible to participate in both of those. For the community meetings, we knew that we wanted to make it as convenient as possible for people to attend the meetings, so we always planned to hold a meeting in each ward of the city, which is 12 in all. We also always knew that we wanted these meetings to be an opportunity for us to explain the ordinance to people and get their feedback. But as we worked on the ordinance, we realized how important it was going to be for us as the planning staff to be able to step back from running the meetings and bring in a neutral third party. We wanted to ensure the objectivity of data collection, meaning that we wanted people to be free to speak candidly and for their comments to be accurately recorded and reported for people who are not as close to the ordinance as we were. So that is why we partnered with the UNH Cooperative Extension to facilitate the meetings. The staff of the Cooperative Extension hold community meetings all across the state on all sorts of different topics. We knew that they would help us run the meetings in a way that made people feel comfortable saying what they really thought, and that they could be able to record those thoughts in an accurate and neutral way. From the first meeting that we held on July 10th to the last meeting we held on September 4th, we were blown away with the attendance and the enthusiasm that the people of Manchester brought to these meetings. More than 1,000 people attended the meetings in all. The average attendance was around 90 people per meeting, and they were mostly held in school gymnasiums, which were not air-conditioned, but despite that, we had a couple of meetings that were so well attended that we didn't have enough seats, and people had to stand in the back. Just to give you a little sense of how those meetings went, they began with people signing in. And we asked people to sign in so that they could track the attendance and so that we could sign people up for an email list if they wanted to get news from us. After people signed in, they would usually walk to the different maps that we had around the room and they could talk with staff members about any questions they had. We would usually point out to them what the zoning was proposed to be at their properties. We also brought plenty of food to each meeting. We figured that if we were going to ask people to spend a couple of hours with us on a Saturday morning or a Wednesday night, we could at least feed them. UNH suggested that we also engage people right at the beginning with a chance to vote on zoning issues that were important to them, so the staff from UNH set up a dot voting station at each meeting. Each person who came would get 2 dots, which were stickers that they could place under a few different topics that were listed on sheets of paper hung on the wall, as you can see on the left side of this picture. People could put a dot under 2 different topics or 2 dots under 1 topic, but the goal was to get people to say what they wanted to prioritize with the proposed zoning ordinance. When the meetings were done, the staff from UNH collected the paper and cataloged how many people voted on each ward. There were also large sheets of paper at each table so that people could write additional comments beyond the topics hung on the wall. It was a good way to get more free-form comments and to allow people to write things down as they sat during a presentation that I gave at each meeting. And the staff from UNH collected these papers and documented all of the comments. The formal start of the meetings was usually Mayor Ruiz saying a few words, and I want to thank him for his attendance at these meetings and his support for the ordinance as a whole. And it never hurts to have a celebrity who shows up at meetings like this. And after Mayor Ruiz spoke, I would give a presentation about the proposed zoning ordinance, and I would talk about how the ordinance was based on the new master plan for the city and what the zoning ordinance was attempting to achieve for the whole city. I would also talk about what it meant for the particular ward that we were in. And the goal was always to explain the zoning ordinance as clearly as possible so that people could provide informed feedback. And after the presentation, the staff from UNH would ask everyone to join one of a number of small groups that would be set up around the room. Everyone in the group would be given an opportunity to talk about what they thought and ask any questions that they had. The staff from UNH would record all of these comments on large sheets of paper. At the end of each meeting, there would be numerous sheets of paper from each group that were full of comments. Members of the planning staff and UNH would read all of the comments to everyone who was there so that they could all learn about what was said in the different groups. After the meetings, the staff from UNH took the pages from the small groups and the pages from the dot voting and the comments that people wrote on all the papers at their tables and used them to help them write a report on what people said at the meetings. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk more about the report that the staff from the UNH Cooperative Extension wrote about the community meetings, but for now I'll just say that it is a culmination of the meetings that catalogs all of the comments that people made and highlights main themes that the staff from UNH observed as they listened to about 1,000 Manchester residents talk about their city. The report is on the website for anyone who is interested. And I also want to note that all of the meetings got great media coverage thanks to Andy Sylvia at Manchester Inklink, who attended all the meetings. He gave up a lot of his nights and weekends to do it, and we really appreciate it because it created another way for people to find out about what was going on. And that's why I bring it up. It was a great way for people to stay engaged. As I said earlier, the second main component of the public engagement was a survey conducted by the UNH Survey Center. The letter that we sent to all the households in the city was an important part of the survey. Not only did it make people aware, but it also had a QR code that people could scan with their phones. And scanning the code took people directly to the survey, which made it quick and easy to participate in. There was also a link on the website to the survey, and it was available on paper at the planning department if people preferred that. And each letter that went out had a unique identifier, which was a code that people could enter when taking the survey. This allowed the staff at the UNH Survey Center to pinpoint the location of each respondent so that they could ask questions about people's neighborhoods or wards or other geographic locations and know roughly where people were talking about. The Survey Center did not share those specific identifiers with city staff, so we had no way of knowing exactly who responded to each question, which protected anonymity. And as I said, the point really was just understanding approximate geography. The Survey Center had a number of safeguards like this to ensure the integrity of the survey process. Another was fraud detection software that they used to identify whether there were any suspicious responses to the survey, such as if multiple responses came in from the same computer or phone. At the conclusion of the survey, UNH reported that there were no suspicious responses. Here are a few highlights about the participation in the survey. A total of 1,499 people took it, and of those, 1,435, or 96% of the respondents, reported living in Manchester. 1,056 of the respondents, or 70%, used the unique identifier that was included in the letter that was mailed to them. UNH was able to determine the approximate locations of another 325 people from the information provided about the street people lived on and the closest intersections to their homes. So UNH had reliable information about the locations of about 92% of the respondents. Again, the location information of individual respondents was not shared with staff, but it was helpful for UNH to create aggregated information about how people in different areas of the city responded to different questions. So let me talk for a minute or two about what the survey actually looked like and what it asked. Here is a picture of the introductory page of the survey. The part on the left is what it looked like on paper or on a computer, and on the right is what it looked like on a phone. This was the introductory page, and it just thanked the person who took the survey for their participation and told them how long the survey would take and what it was about and who to contact if they had any questions. There were a lot of questions on the survey, and so I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think it would be useful to show a few examples of the types of questions that were asked. The survey started off with a question about the respondents' connection to Manchester. There were a number of other demographic questions like age and education, but we put those at the end because we didn't want to scare people off right at the beginning. The important demographic information for us was whether the person lived in Manchester or worked in Manchester or had some other connection, so we asked that first, and then we got right into the substance of the questions. The next question asked what sort of development people might like to see in Manchester, such as large residential, small residential, office, entertainment, restaurants, and industrial. And then we asked what types of buildings people thought would fit in their neighborhoods. There were a few questions like this that asked about people's neighborhoods, so getting that location information was useful because we could see how people in different areas of the city thought differently about things like what types of buildings they wanted to see near them. We also tried to make some of these questions as relatable as possible, so we included pictures where we could. You can see on the right that the pictures showed up pretty well on people's phones. We had questions that asked people to say whether they agreed with certain statements about zoning. Here, the question asked whether people agreed or disagreed with the statement about property maintenance, preservation of natural areas, whether the appearance of new buildings should fit in with existing buildings, and historic character. We thought that walkability would be a topic that people cared about, so we asked about that. We also knew that housing would be an important topic, so we asked numerous questions about housing, such as whether people thought more housing should be constructed, whether there should be different types of housing at different price points, and what people thought about the quality of housing in Manchester, and what types of new housing, if any, should be built, such as houses, duplexes, apartments, and senior housing. We also asked about small businesses like coffee shops, convenience stores, and salons, and whether they should be allowed in select residential areas that are already close to commercial areas. We asked some questions about design, which made the pictures really useful. This question asked about building design and which building would be more preferable to walk next to. This question asked about parking lot design. Parking was another topic that we thought would be important to people, so we asked a few questions about that. We're going to get into all of this in a few minutes, so I won't get into detail now. And we also asked about signs, such as what types of signs people preferred and where they thought certain types of signs should be allowed. At the bottom of this question is a blank where people can write in additional comments. There were a few different questions that had this option. And there was also a question that simply just asked people if they had anything they wanted to tell us. We got 860 free response comments, and we cataloged all of them, and we used that data as well. So the meetings concluded on September 7th, and the survey closed on September 8th. Thousands of comments and survey responses came out of that effort, and I just want to pause for a minute to recognize not only the hard work of the planning staff and the staff from the UNH Survey Center and the UNH Cooperative Extension who made this a success, but most importantly, I want to recognize the participation of the citizens of Manchester, who came out on weeknights and weekends in the summer, and even the people who just spent 15 minutes to fill out the survey. Most people won't take time to do things like that, but many citizens of Manchester did, and I want to thank them because this public engagement would not have been successful without them. Lots of people who participated in these community meetings told us that they don't usually get involved in government, but they found out about what was going on and they wanted to participate. There was a great discussion that I had with a woman at the meeting for Ward 9 who said she was 81 years old, she had lived in Ward 9 her entire life, and this was the first time that she had ever heard anything about zoning. And it occurred to me after the discussion that she had lived through 2 prior rewrites of the Manchester zoning ordinance because she was there for the one in 1965 and for the one in 2001. But it wasn't until the meeting in 2024 that she heard anything about it. So that was an indication to me that the process of public engagement for this new zoning ordinance was able to reach people in a way that hadn't happened before. And I think it's fair to say that this was, by a long shot, the most participation that the City of Manchester has ever gotten for the drafting of a zoning ordinance. And I think there's a pretty good chance that it's the most participation that any municipality in New Hampshire has gotten for the drafting of a zoning ordinance. I don't know what every other town or city in New Hampshire has done to solicit comments, but I know that the process tends to be a couple of community meetings where a few people show up, and then there's the statutorily required public hearing, and then it's done. What the people of Manchester helped us do here was truly exceptional, and I want to thank them for that. So, after we held all of the meetings and collected all of the data, what did we find out? That's what we're going to talk about in this next section called the results of public engagement. The staff from the UNH Cooperative Extension and the staff from the UNH Survey Center worked through the fall to each produce a report about what they learned from Manchester's residents. While the Manchester Master Plan was our guiding document when we wrote the first draft of the zoning ordinance, these two reports were our guiding documents when we wrote the second draft. Both reports are on the website for anyone who wants to read them. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the contents of each report, starting with the UNH Cooperative Extension's report about the community meetings. And in the first few pages of that report, the Cooperative Extension summarized what they called their key observations from what people said at the community meetings. The text of the report is a little hard to read in this slide, so I listed those key observations on the left, and I'll quickly describe what UNH said about each one. Starting with housing affordability, UNH said that this was a highly important issue in all wards. They said that there is, quote, significant support for granting more flexibility for residential uses in order to enable more residential developments and increase the city's number and range of housing stock. They went on to say that, quote, participants preferred to see more housing in the form of accessory dwelling units, duplexes and triplexes, upper story residential over buildings with street level commercial, and smaller single-family homes. They also said that while some people supported allowing larger apartment buildings in more places, there were also people who said that larger apartment buildings should be limited to areas that already have them. Further along in the report, UNH went into detail on what was said in each ward, and for all of the wards, UNH did a ranking of the issues that were most important to the participants. I've copied all of those rankings here, and you can see that housing made the list of the top 5 issues for all wards and was ranked as the most important issue in 9 of the wards. So UNH emphasized throughout the report that housing affordability was a high priority across the city. The next item on UNH's list, and the one that came up almost as much as housing, was walkability. People expressed a strong desire for the city to be more walkable. Some of the things they mentioned didn't directly relate to zoning, like improving sidewalks and adding traffic calming, but UNH noted that there were also plenty of comments that did relate to zoning. People said that they wanted to allow small businesses to locate in more areas of the city to have places to walk to, and people wanted to see building designs and site designs that were more pleasant to walk next to. And that brings us to the next item on the list, which is design standards that uphold the quality and character of development. UNH said that participants had, quote, an overwhelming desire to ensure that future development is compatible with the character of existing neighborhoods. They went on to say that, quote, residents supported design standards and more code enforcement as ways to preserve and enhance the quality and character of the city's neighborhoods. The next item on UNH's list is the capacity of infrastructure and services. Residents in a number of wards raised concerns about the impact that new development might have on things like sewer, water, police, school enrollment, and traffic. Particularly important to some people was parking and how, at least in some areas of the city, the on-street parking is at full capacity, and it leads people to park in illegal ways. As UNH noted, there was tension between some comments that wanted to reduce the amount of on-site parking that the zoning ordinance requires to allow land to be used for buildings, and other comments that wanted to keep the amount of required parking the way it is so that streets did not get too crowded. The fifth item on UNH's list is streamlining the development review process. This was another topic in which there was some tension between the comments. UNH said that some people wanted regulations that, quote, would improve predictability, shorten review timeframes, and reduce the need to go through the variance process. UNH went on to say that, quote, at the same time, some also expressed their desire for more opportunities to participate, engage in, and be heard throughout the planning and development review processes. So that is a summary of UNH's summary of the comments that they got from residents during the Ward 12 meetings. And after the summary, the report goes into detail on what people said at each ward meeting. This is a great way to get more of a feel for the differences between the wards. I won't go through all of the different wards in this presentation, but we absolutely use this information when thinking about the preferences that people had in each ward. And then the report catalogs all of the comments that were recorded by the UNH staff during the meetings. These comments go on for 30 pages, and anyone who's interested is free to download the report from the website and read them. A little while ago, Kristen and I invited all of the aldermen to meet with us to talk about the second draft of the proposed zoning ordinance, and we gave each alderman a packet of information that included these comments from their ward so that they could read what their constituents said. So these comments have been really useful in understanding what people want. And what became really clear during the ward meetings and from reading UNH's report about the meetings is that although there are some main themes like housing that carried across all of the wards, there are also important differences between what the people of each ward want. Of course, wards are made up of lots of different people with lots of different ideas, but within each ward, there were majority opinions and some main ideas that rose to the top. For instance, the majority of people in wards 3 and 5 and 11 were pretty comfortable with increasing housing supply and making it easier for small businesses to be located closer to residential areas, while the majority of people in wards 6, 8, and 10 did not feel that way as much and instead focused on maintaining the existing character of their neighborhoods. Fortunately, the proposed zoning ordinance can accommodate these differences because zoning can make distinctions based on geography. That is actually what zoning is supposed to do. We're going to get into that more later, but I wanted to mention it now since we're talking about what people said during the ward meetings. Okay, so now let's spend a few minutes talking about the report from the UNH Survey Center. As with the report from the UNH Cooperative Extension, this report is on the website for anyone who wants to read it. It's fairly long, it's 200 pages, but it is a really good read and it's well worth it. It provides great insight on how the people of Manchester think about a range of topics related to zoning and land use. And maybe this should go without saying, but I was pleased to see that the results of this survey were remarkably consistent with the comments that came up in the community meetings. The main themes that were true across the city in the meetings were true in the survey, and the different characteristics of preferences in different wards showed up here as well. And to me, that consistency among the two different sources of information shows that we got an accurate picture of how the people of Manchester think. So let's talk about what the survey found. The report starts with demographics, and I think that's also a good place for us to start. As I said earlier, the first question that the survey asked was about the connection that the respondent had to Manchester. It was important to us to get that information so that we knew who was giving us the answers to the questions. As the graph shows, 97% of the people who took the survey reported living in Manchester. That is significant for a number of reasons. It means that nearly everyone who took the survey probably knows Manchester pretty well, and it means that because they live here, they have a strong interest in the city's future. When I first read this graph, I was actually a little puzzled about why the other numbers dropped off so quickly. It seems strange that 90% of respondents lived in Manchester, but only 31% worked in Manchester, and only 11% had a child that attended school in Manchester. The next graph cleared up some of that confusion. This shows the distribution of ages among the respondents. You can see that the age group that was most represented was people who were 65 and older. It is unlikely that people in this age group are working or that they have children in school, so it makes sense that they wouldn't have answered yes to either of those questions. The next highest groups were two that tied at 21% each. They were people aged 18 to 34 and people aged 55 to 64. There's a good chance that most people in these age groups either don't have children or have children who are away at college or otherwise out of school. So that leaves the two smallest groups of people who are most likely to be working and to be raising children. And I would guess that there are a fair number of these people who took the survey and who live in Manchester but who might work elsewhere. Relating this more to zoning, what this age distribution suggests is that most of the people who took the survey are old enough to own their own home. Many people in their 50s and 60s have owned their homes long enough to have paid off their mortgages or at least locked in pretty low interest rates from a long time ago. And if you look at the answer to this question, that supposition is pretty well confirmed. The survey asked about home ownership, and as you might have expected, the majority of people who took the survey own their primary residence. The survey also asked how long respondents have lived in Manchester. As you can see, 40% of the people who took the survey said that they have lived in Manchester for at least 30 years. 68% of people said that they have lived in Manchester for at least 10 years. So the demographics paint a picture of the majority of respondents who are middle-aged and up, own their own homes, and have been in Manchester for at least a decade. You might think this would lead to results that don't indicate much concern about housing. With most people owning their own homes already, they might not think housing prices are a big deal, but as we already discussed with the community meetings, the people of Manchester have strong concerns about the cost of housing, and the same concerns showed up in the survey results. So let's talk about what the survey showed for housing. The responses to this first question tell us a lot. Excuse me. The question was, how reasonable would you say that the price of housing is in Manchester? And 74% of respondents said that it was either not very reasonable or not reasonable at all. The highest percentage was for not reasonable at all. With the green bar on the left, 22% of people said that it was somewhat reasonable and just 1% said that it was very reasonable. So a 74% response is a pretty strong indication that housing prices are a concern for people in Manchester. And again, there were 1,499 people who took the survey, so 74% of that is 1,109 people who said that costs are not reasonable in some way. The UNH Survey Center gave us the data for each question broken out by ward, and as you might expect, for each of the 12 wards in the city, a majority of people said that the price of housing in Manchester is not reasonable. Here are some results from a different question on the survey. This is really 3 questions about housing in one. The first question was, how important, if at all, do you believe it is for the cost of housing in Manchester to come down? Considering how people answered the prior question, it's pretty understandable that 61% of respondents said that it is very important for them that the cost of housing to come down, and another 26% said that it is somewhat important. So that's 87% of people saying that it is important to them in some way that the cost of housing come down. The next question also got an 87% majority, although with a slightly different distribution on very important and somewhat important. The question was, how important, if at all, do you believe it is for there to be various types of housing available in Manchester, including large and small housing options? So at 87%, it is clear that people in Manchester think there should be a range of housing types in the city. It was interesting, though, to look at the data by ward on this question. Here are the responses to the question about the range of housing types from wards 3 and 6. For anyone who's not aware, Ward 3 is the downtown. It is Elm Street and surrounding areas, so it is one of the most densely populated wards with probably the most range of building types. Ward 6 is mostly west of Interstate 93. It includes Lake Massabesic and surrounding areas, and it is fairly rural and suburban for the most part. The respondents of Ward 3 said overwhelmingly that it was very important to them for there to be a range of housing types, including large and small housing options. None of them, 0%, said that it was not at all important. In contrast, far fewer people in Ward 6 said that it was very important to them to have a range of housing types, and 10% said that it was not important at all. Now, 82% of people in Ward 6 did say that it was important in some way for there to be a range of housing types, so I don't want to make too much of the difference in responses, but when you look at the ward data, you can start to see the difference in personalities of the different wards, and as I said earlier, that's all fine. Zoning can accommodate those different preferences because zoning can change based on geography. That is the whole point. The third part of this question asked how important, if at all, it was to respondents that new housing be built in Manchester. As you can see, 80% of people said that it was either very important or somewhat important to them that new housing be built. So another strong response in favor of housing, this time regarding additional housing supply. Let's do another comparison of Ward 3 and Ward 6. You can see that 72% of people said that it was very important to them in Ward 3 that new housing get built, compared with 38% in Ward 6. There were 23% of people in Ward 6 who said that it was not really important for housing to get built, compared with 6% in Ward 3. Again, I don't want to make too much of these differences because 72% of people in Ward 6 still said that it was important for new housing to get built in Manchester. There is clear support for new housing in Ward 6, as there is across the city, but I just want to point out how the public opinion in Manchester is not all the same. There are nuances that depend on where people are. Here is another question about housing. It gave people a list of housing types to choose from, and it asked them to select all of the types that they would like to see in Manchester, assuming that the types would be restricted to compatible areas, meaning that high-rises wouldn't be allowed to be plunked down next to single-family homes, for instance. The top response, getting 62% of people to click on it, was small houses on small lots. And that is in contrast with large houses on large lots, which only 29% of respondents clicked on, which is much further down the list. That difference is entirely consistent with many comments that we got during the community meetings. People said that there should be more starter homes, meaning smaller homes on smaller lots, which would be more affordable, both for people who are trying to buy their first home, but also for people whose children have left and want to downsize. Let's go back to demographics for a minute. The 3 best represented age groups in the survey were people who are young enough to be buying their first homes or who are old enough that their kids are probably out of the house. There are also lots of people in the older groups whose children are trying to buy homes, and so the parents understand how hard it can be for someone to buy their first home. So it makes complete sense that the smaller houses would get a lot of support. Beyond the survey, though, we know that the economics of housing right now are pushing builders to construct larger houses, and that is especially true where zoning requires large lots, because the more land that is required per house, the bigger the house needs to be for the builder to make a profit. So zoning can be part of the solution by reducing minimum lot sizes, and that is something we tried to address with the proposed zoning ordinance. Going back to this question for a minute, I want to point out that a few other housing types that got a majority of respondents also showed up, and those were townhouses, small apartment buildings, and senior housing. This was one of those questions that also let people write in additional comments, and we got nearly 180 written responses. The topic that was written about more than any other was affordable housing. There were a few other questions about housing, but if I went through every question on the survey, we'd be here all night. So just to summarize, there was a clear, strong response across the city that housing is too expensive and that more housing is needed. Let's move on to a few other topics. This was a question where we got really strong responses. The question asked whether people agreed or disagreed with 4 different statements. The first statement was, "It is important to me to preserve the existing natural areas of Manchester." 94% of people agreed with that statement. That is consistent with comments from the community meetings as well. Despite Manchester being the largest city in the state, people here care a lot about preserving natural resources. The next statement was, "It is important to me to preserve the historic character of certain areas in Manchester, like the Mill Yard." 90% of people agreed with that. The next statement was, "There should be minimum standards for how buildings and properties are built and maintained so that they look good." 86% of people agreed with that statement. As I said earlier, that was another comment that came up a fair amount during the community meetings. The fourth statement was, "If a new building is going to be built in your neighborhood, it should fit with the buildings that are already there." 82% of people agreed with that. This question is about community character and appearance, which was one of the main points of the city's master plan from a few years ago and was a common priority for people in the community meetings. So to summarize, we got some pretty good direction from this question about things that are important to people, and they include natural resources, historic character, and standards to ensure that properties are well maintained and fit within their neighborhoods. Next, let's talk about small businesses. This question asked whether respondents would support or oppose allowing small-scale businesses such as coffee shops, convenience stores, and salons in select residential neighborhoods that are located close to commercial areas. In other words, the question is asking whether people think it's appropriate to allow small businesses to extend beyond commercial areas that are existing into residential areas, but it is not asking whether businesses should just be able to show up anywhere in the middle of a single-family district. As I said a fair amount during the presentation for the first draft a year ago, the goal of the proposed zoning ordinance is not to do anything drastic, but rather to allow for small amounts of incremental changes where it would make sense in the context of what is going on already. And that is what this question is asking about regarding the location of small businesses expanding from where they are already allowed. And as the graph shows, 80% of respondents supported the idea of allowing small-scale businesses in select residential neighborhoods. This is another question that is interesting to consider the differences in the wards. This time, let's use Ward 8 and Ward 11. Ward 8 is at the southern end of Manchester. It includes some of South Willow Street and the airport and some industrial areas, along with a number of single-family neighborhoods. Ward 11 is on the west side. It includes Amory Street, Bremer Street, and West High School. In the community meeting for Ward 11 and in their survey responses, the residents of Ward 11 consistently expressed a desire for allowing more small businesses in neighborhoods, both as part of mixed-use buildings with apartments above businesses and as standalone buildings. The residents of Ward 8 were less enthusiastic about mixed use, although, as with Ward 6, I don't want to read too much into it. As this shows, 75% of the people of Ward 8 said that they supported allowing small businesses in some residential areas. That is still most of the people, but I think you can see the little differences between the two wards. There was a follow-up question to the question about small businesses. It asked whether people would be more or less likely to want to allow small businesses in select residential neighborhoods if the appearance of the businesses were required to conform to the character of the neighborhood, meaning if the business had to look like the buildings that were already there. This question is getting at how design can play a role in making different uses more compatible. UNH's graphs in their report are usually excellent, but this one is not the easiest to make sense of. The bottom line here is that 75% of the respondents agreed that they would be more likely to want to allow businesses in residential areas if the businesses looked like other buildings in the neighborhood. And that is useful for us as we think about how to accommodate the 80% of people who said that they want to allow some expansion of where small businesses are allowed, with the understandable concern that some people have about businesses being out of place. And that gets us into some questions about design. The proposed Manchester zoning ordinance would give the city more tools to regulate building appearance than the current zoning ordinance does. And so we wanted to see if people had strong opinions about building design, and as you can see from the results of this question, they definitely do. The question asked whether people would prefer to walk on a sidewalk that was next to a blank wall or a building with windows. 99% of people said that they preferred the building with windows to the building without them. That's about as clear a message as you're going to get. This question also touched on walkability, which was a really popular topic at the ward meeting, so we got direction on 2 different topics with this question. Another design question asked about parking lots and whether people preferred there to be landscaping around parking lots or not. 93% of respondents said that they preferred parking lots with landscaping, so we got good direction on that. And that is a good transition to talk about parking. Parking is a topic that we know a lot of people care about, so we asked multiple questions about it on the survey. This question asks how often people can find parking when they go to a list of different places. For your neighborhood, which is basically where people live, 73% of people said that they could find parking always, and another 20% said that they could find it most of the time. The answer was similar for finding parking at shopping destinations, with 92% of people saying always or most of the time, although the number of always responses was a little down. The answer was also similar when people went to school or work at 89% for always or most of the time, and the numbers dropped with the mill yard and downtown. This graph shows responses to the same question, but it breaks them out by ward, and it focuses just on the questions about finding parking where people live. UNH did this just to provide some additional detail on the responses. As you can see, there were pretty strong responses across all wards about finding parking, but as with pretty much all questions, there was some variation among the wards. Wards 3, 11, 5, and 7 have a good number of old buildings that were built before zoning laws, and those buildings are on small lots, so there isn't as much room for parking. So it makes sense that those wards had the lowest responses to this question. Again, I don't want to overstate anything. More than 80% of the respondents from those wards said that they could find parking in a reasonable time, always or most of the time, but you can see the slight differences among the wards with this question. Here's another parking question that generated a pretty strong response. The question asked how important it is to the respondent that a business they go to provide a dedicated location for parking beyond what is available on the street. In other words, the question is asking whether people want to ensure that there is parking on site. 77% of people said that it is very important or somewhat important, and 21% of people said that it's not that important. Here's a graph that I put together to show the differentiation among the wards based on the question about business parking. I combined the 2 categories of very important and somewhat important just to make the blue lines a little easier to read, and the red lines are the 2 categories about not important, just so that there were, as I said, 2 bars per ward rather than 4. As you can see, the majority of respondents said that it was important to them to have dedicated parking when they went to a business, but there were some wards, like wards 6, 7, and 8, where it was more important to them than in other wards. More than 40% of the people in Ward 3 said that it wasn't all that important to them, which makes sense considering that Ward 3 is the downtown and people probably don't mind walking a little to their destination. This question and the next one are pretty interesting. We tried to figure out people's priorities between parking and either housing or businesses. It is often the case that there are space constraints on a lot and builders need to choose how to use that space. They need to choose between adding square footage for a building or adding parking. So here we asked people which of the following statements they agreed with most. The first statement said, the city should prioritize required dedicated parking spots for homes, even if that means fewer new homes. The second statement said, the city should reduce parking requirements to allow for more land to be used for housing, even if that means some new homes will not include a dedicated parking spot for each resident. The graph shows that 64% of people agreed with the statement that the city should prioritize requiring parking spaces, even at the result of fewer homes being created. That was far more than the 25% of people who said that it would be okay for the city to reduce parking requirements, even if some new homes wouldn't have dedicated parking spaces. This is interesting because of how many people said it was important to them to have more housing. both during the community meetings and in the survey. People also recognized in the community meetings and in the survey that the cost of housing is too high and that adding supply would help to bring prices down, but it seems like if forced to choose between housing and parking, the majority of people seem to lean toward parking rather than housing. So these different responses created a bit of a challenge for us as we tried to write the second draft and manage these different priorities. I think we found a pretty good middle ground, and I will get into that further along in the presentation. Here's a graph showing how people from different wards answered the question. You can see that there really was a strong preference for parking in wards 6, 7, 8, and 12. Wards 1, 2, 4, and 5 were closer, and Ward 3 flipped, meaning that the respondents from Ward 3 prioritized housing instead of prioritizing parking. And again, this makes sense since most of Ward 3 is taken up by the Central Business District, which is a zoning district that does not require any parking at all. Again, people in the downtown just don't expect parking in the way that people in some other wards do. This is the second question that we asked regarding prioritizing parking. It is similar to the prior one about housing, but this is about businesses. The question asks, if forced to choose, which of the following comes closest to your opinion regarding business development and parking requirements in Manchester? Then the first statement is, the city should prioritize requiring dedicated parking spots for business customers, even if that means less square footage for businesses. And the second statement is, the city should reduce parking requirements to allow for more land to be used for businesses, even if that means some new businesses will not include dedicated parking spots for customers. The graph shows that there was a majority of respondents who said that parking requirements should be prioritized, even if that takes away from space left for businesses. There were 30% of people who felt the opposite, so this was a little closer than the last question. And here are the ward results. You can see that wards 6, 7, 8, 9, and 12 were pretty strongly in favor of prioritizing parking, but it was a little closer call for wards 1, 2, 4, and 5, and 11. And again, Ward 3 flipped the priority and prioritized businesses rather than parking. I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about signs. Zoning regulates the types of signs that are allowed in different places, and so we wanted to get a clear understanding from the people of Manchester about what they liked and didn't like with signs. The first question asked which of the two sign types shown in the picture people preferred to see in their neighborhood or in the area of Manchester where they spent the most time. The signs on the left are small signs that are hung on the side of a building, and the sign on the right is a large freestanding sign. As you can see from the responses, 96% of people preferred the small signs to the large sign. That's not to say that people thought the large sign was inappropriate in all locations, but the preference for neighborhoods was clearly the small sign. The next question asked about billboards and where they should be allowed. The largest group of responses, 48%, said nowhere. They don't want billboards anywhere in the city. Close behind that, 46% of people said that billboards should be allowed on commercial corridors like South Willow Street and 2nd Street, and then much smaller groups of people thought billboards would be okay in the downtown and the Mill Yard. We also asked about signs called electronic message centers, or EMCs. These are signs with screens that are basically television screens that can show text and images. And we asked people whether these sorts of signs would be permitted in a range of different, or should be permitted, in a range of different places. As you can see from the results, 62% of people said that these signs would be okay in the commercial, automobile-centered shopping areas like South Willow Street and Hooksett Road. And that was the only area that got a majority of responses, saying that they should be allowed. The other areas that we asked had pretty strong majorities against EMCs. Those were areas with walkable shopping areas like downtown, the Mill Yard, and residential neighborhoods. So if you put the responses from these three questions together, it's pretty clear that for the most areas of the city, people don't really want to see billboards, large freestanding signs, or EMCs. There seems to be a majority of people who are okay with these sorts of larger, flashier signs in selected, highly commercial, automobile-centered places like South Willow Street, 2nd Street, and Hooksett Road, but there's a sizable number of people who don't even really want them there, and there really isn't much support for them going anywhere else. Now I want to talk about a question we asked about murals. Manchester has a lot of murals. They have become really popular as a way to make blank walls more appealing and to create a fun atmosphere even in some of our alleys. The problem is figuring out the difference between a mural and just advertising. This is a picture of a bakery in Conway, New Hampshire that has been in the news lately because the town of Conway regulated the painting on top of the building as a sign, and told the bakery owner that he had violated the town's sign ordinance by making a sign that was too big. They said that the painting was advertising because it showed the products that were sold in the business. If the painting had been something different, like a landscape with no baked goods, it would have been a mural and would have been fine, but because it showed pictures of what the business sold, it was an advertisement and therefore a sign. This sort of regulation of paintings and other murals was pretty common, and we regulated paintings in the same way in Manchester. We would look at what the painting showed, and if it was advertising, we would regulate it, and if it wasn't, we wouldn't. But that had to change fairly recently because the U.S. Supreme Court decided 2 cases in 2022 that said that it was a violation of the First Amendment for municipalities to regulate the content of signs with limited exceptions. So a city or town can't really get into what has been painted on the sign, and we can't distinguish between content that is an advertisement and content that is not. Based on that precedent, the owner of this bakery fought the regulation of the mural on top of his building. He filed in federal district court, and earlier this year, the court ruled in his favor, saying that the town of Conway had violated the First Amendment by calling this a sign due to its advertising content. So, based on the U.S. Supreme Court's case from a few years ago and this recent case from the District of New Hampshire, we are in more of an all-or-nothing environment. Either we let pretty much all murals go unregulated, or we regulate all of them regardless of what they say. So because of the 2 U.S. Supreme Court cases and the district court case that was being litigated at the time, we asked a question about about murals on the survey. We said, due to recent decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court, cities must either allow private buildings to display murals that express commercial speech or not allow murals on private buildings basically at all. If you had to choose, would you prefer the city of Manchester to allow commercial buildings to have murals, including artistic murals and advertising murals, or to not allow murals on commercial buildings at all? And as you can see, 70% of the people who answered the question said that they wanted to allow commercial buildings to have murals, including artistic murals and advertising murals, and only 23% said not to allow murals at all. So that gave us some good direction on how to handle murals, which we will talk about in a little bit. There were more questions on the survey, and I could talk more about them, but I think what we have discussed so far gives a pretty good sense of the types of questions we asked and the types of responses people made. So I want to summarize what we learned from the survey. First and foremost, people had strong opinions about housing. They said that prices are too high and that the supply and variety of housing types should be increased to allow for more people to be able to afford a home. The housing types that got the most support were smaller houses that are good for both young families starting out and for seniors who wanted to downsize, but there was also a lot of support for townhouses, small multifamily buildings, and duplexes, with people saying that larger residential buildings should be reserved for commercial areas and areas that already have apartment buildings. The next topic is the preservation of natural and historic areas. There really isn't too much to say about this at this point, aside from that there was nearly unanimous support for finding ways to preserve Manchester's natural resources and areas of historic character like the Mill Yard. Next, regarding character and design, people said that new buildings should fit in with their surroundings. They strongly preferred buildings with architectural detailing like windows and doors to blank walls, and they strongly preferred landscaped commercial areas to those without landscaping. Regarding parking, for most people, they could find it pretty much all the time, at home and at work. For people in some wards, like wards 3, 11, 5, and 7, there were decent percentages of people who said most of the time, rather than all the time, though. And as for trying to find parking downtown and in the Mill Yard, people said that could be more challenging. As for parking requirements, majorities of people said that they like parking requirements and that parking requirements are important enough they should be imposed, even if they take away from some square footage that could be used for housing or businesses. This was a closer call in some wards than others, though. Regarding signs, there were clear answers that most people prefer smaller, less flashy signs in most areas of the city, including downtown, and that they wanted to restrict the large-scale billboards and freestanding signs and EMCs to the sort of places that are intensely commercial and cater to automobile-centered forms of commerce like South Willow Street. Additionally, people showed an appreciation for murals, and they are willing to deal with some commercial advertising that might go along with murals. So, that is a summary of what we learned from the public engagement and that the planning staff and our partners did last summer. The job of the planning staff has been to write a new zoning ordinance for the city, and the most important thing that we have wanted to do is to ensure that the new zoning ordinance reflects the will of the people of Manchester. That has been our goal from the beginning, and we wouldn't have been able to do it nearly as well if we hadn't gotten such great participation from the people of Manchester and such thorough analysis from our partners at UNH. So, when the public engagement was done, we started work on the second draft of the zoning ordinance, incorporating what we learned from public comment, But we didn't do it alone. We had help from 10 dedicated citizens of Manchester who were members of the Zoning Ordinance Steering Committee. This was a committee assembled specifically for the purpose of bringing more perspective from the citizens of Manchester into the writing of the zoning ordinance. The members consist of 6 people who are members of city boards, which were the Zoning Board of Adjustment, the Planning Board, the Board of Mayor and Aldermen, the Heritage Commission, and the Housing Commission. The other 4 members are designees chosen by Mayor Rouet. The people on this committee range in experience from people who work professionally in ways that interact with zoning, like real estate brokerage, housing development, and land surveying, to people who don't have a lot of experience with zoning, but who do have a lot of experience in Manchester, such as running businesses, owning property, renting property, and in one case, being a real expert in the history of Manchester. They gave the writing of the zoning ordinance a huge amount of their time and effort. They met at City Hall with the planning staff a total of 14 times during the course of about a year, with most meetings taking a couple of hours. They spent a lot of time on their own reading proposed language and getting familiar with zoning, and they attended many of the community meetings that were held last summer. During the course of writing the second draft, the planning staff brought proposed edits to the committee meetings, explained the edits, and asked for the committee's take on whether they liked them or not. For every edit that we brought to them, if they liked it, we included it in the second draft, and if they didn't, we didn't put it in. So they had substantial editorial control on edits that were made to the document. And before getting into what is now in the second draft, I want to acknowledge the huge role that the committee played. The second draft would not be what it is without them, so I want to thank them for their time and expertise. Let's start with a topic that was the most important to the people of Manchester, which is housing. As a reminder, we got strong responses from the survey that prices are too high, supply and variety of housing should be increased, and that smaller houses and smaller forms of multifamily housing are pretty widely accepted, while larger buildings were preferable for the more commercial areas and areas that already have large apartment buildings. As the Cooperative Extension said in their report, quote, housing affordability was identified in all wards as a critical issue. A review of the comments shows that there is significant support for granting more flexibility for residential uses in order to enable more residential developments and increase the city's number and range of housing stock. Strategies often supported including lowering minimum lot dimensions for residential lots and reducing the minimum floor area required per residential unit. As the first 2 bullet points on this list suggest, the problem of high prices is related to supply. It is a basic law of economics that when supply doesn't keep up with demand, prices rise, and so the public comments accurately reflect that problem and propose a solution that supply and variety of housing should be increased. Increasing the variety of housing by allowing smaller houses, townhouses, duplexes, and small multifamily is really just another way of adding supply because you can get more dwelling units per acre. Another proposed solution, as stated in the quote from UNH, is to lower the minimum dimensions for residential lots. So it was the job of the planning staff to bring all of this public sentiment into the zoning ordinance, and here's some of how we did that. This is a map of all of the proposed single-family districts in the city, meaning that this is where the only type of housing that the zoning ordinance would allow is a single house per lot. This is what these districts would look like with the second draft, and it's quite similar to what they look like today, although they have shrunk in size a little bit. It's hard to see any detail at this scale, but the point is to show the big picture that the single-family districts are mostly located around the periphery of the city. This is where people told us that they mostly don't want to see more intense housing types, but they are interested in allowing for smaller starter homes and accessory dwelling units. The names of these single-family districts are the RS, the R1A, and the R1B. In those areas, we mostly adopted the strategy proposed in the public comments to reduce minimum lot sizes. The goal would be to reduce the overall cost of housing by reducing the amount of land that is necessary to build a house. It would add variety by making it at least a little more economical for builders to construct smaller single-family homes because the amount of land needed to build a house would be less. As you may recall from the survey results, the most requested type of new housing for the city was single-family homes on smaller lots, so that is what the second draft would attempt to encourage. This would be a fairly small change to the single-family districts because they are mostly already fully developed. The benefit would be in the few remaining areas that are undeveloped, although it is possible that an additional lot could be created in limited circumstances. It would also benefit those existing homes that are on fairly small lots already because it would allow them a little more flexibility to add parking or a shed or some other structure without it being as necessary for them to go for a variance for something like a setback. At the bottom of the slide is a list of how the lot sizing for those 3 districts would change. The RS district, which has the largest lot requirements for a single-family home, would actually stay the same at 40,000 square feet. That may seem contradictory, but the reason for it staying the same is that some of the RS district still is on private septic systems and not on city sewer. So there are minimum lot sizes imposed by state requirements, and also most of the district is directly adjacent to sensitive natural areas like Lake Massabesic and the Piscataqua River. So it's actually one of the few places in the city where we wouldn't really want to encourage all that much additional housing. The R1A and the R1B take up much more land area in the city, and they would get lot size reductions. The R1A would go from 12,500 to 10,000 square feet, and the R1B would go from 7,500 square feet to 6,000. I mentioned that the area of the city that would allow exclusively single-family homes would shrink, and here's a little more detail on that. Each single-family district would shrink by about 3 or 4%, which results in a total reduction across the city of about 10%, from 55.1% of the city's area to 45.4%. As you can see, the area of the RS district is quite small in comparison to the areas of the R1A and R1B, so the reduction in lot sizes requested by the public would take effect in most of the areas of the city that is exclusively single-family homes. It might not be totally clear what I mean when I say that a district has shrunk, so let me just explain that for a minute. This is a map showing some of the west side. The colors on the map show the proposed zoning districts, and the dark gray lines show the boundaries of the current zoning districts, along with the labels for the current zoning districts. What this map is showing is that this area of the R2 district currently has a western border of about Rochelle Avenue. That border would extend westerly into the lighter yellow area where the red dotted line is. That means that the R1B district, which is the light yellow area to the left of the dotted line, would lose some area, that's the single-family district, and the R2, which is the duplex district, would gain some area. I mentioned that the area of the city that would allow exclusively single-family homes would shrink. I think I did this slide already, sorry. Oh, I went the wrong direction, I apologize. The proposed zoning ordinance would make these sorts of changes in a number of areas throughout the city, and we did them based on, first and foremost, the comments that we got from the public, and then a geographic analysis to try to implement those comments in the right places. Here's the sort of analysis that we did. It showed a map like this at the beginning, I showed a map like this at the beginning of the presentation. It shows all of the current land uses throughout the city. This is that same area on the west side that we just talked about. Anywhere on the map that is colored beige or tan or brown are properties that are being used for duplexes or triple deckers or small apartment buildings, and the white areas are single-family homes. I placed the red dotted line on the map, and you can see how there are a lot of duplexes and some triple deckers already in that area, but that area today is R1B, meaning that it does not allow for duplexes and triple deckers. The proposed zoning ordinance would move the boundary to where the red dotted line is, making all of the duplexes conforming with zoning. So we tried to find areas like this around the city where it made sense to expand areas where more housing could be built, such as by increasing the areas of R2, which allows duplexes. So that is how we get to reduced land area for these single-family zoning districts. And the next aspect of increased supply and variety of housing that I want to discuss is the increase in places where duplexes, triple deckers, townhouses, and small apartments can be built. This was specifically mentioned numerous times in the reports from UNH, and it is an effective way to bring down the cost of housing because these housing types not only can add more supply per acre, but each unit is typically smaller and less expensive than a house. As I discussed in a fair amount of detail during the presentation for the first draft, these housing types are sometimes referred to as missing middle because the number of dwelling units are between a house and a large apartment building, and because they are not built nearly as much today as they used to be. Manchester, of course, is full of duplexes and triple deckers, but far more of those were built 100 years ago than are getting built today. So, starting first with duplexes, there is a zoning district that currently exists that is called the R2 district. We just talked about that. The R stands for residential, and the 2 stands for the maximum number of principal units per building. So the R2 allows for single-family homes and for duplexes, but for nothing more than that. As I just showed with those maps of the west side, there are some places in the city where the R2 district would expand into the current R1B district, meaning that there are places that would go from allowing just single-family homes to allowing duplexes. There are also, though, some places where R2 would shrink. As you can see from this map, the R2 is sort of in the middle between less dense districts on the periphery and the more dense districts in the center of the city. And while the R2 would expand into some less dense districts, it would also lose some area to other districts that I will talk about in a minute. So the result is that the R2 would actually lose some land area in total. It's not much, but it reflects that middle place that it's in. The bottom line, though, is that the proposed zoning ordinance would increase the total area of the city where someone could build a duplex because, as I showed earlier, the total area that limits construction to only single-family homes would decrease. So more duplexes could be built in more places, and that is consistent with what the people told us they wanted. The proposed zoning ordinance would eliminate a few zoning districts like the R3 and the C1 and put 2 new districts mostly in their place, although the entire area is not the same. The new districts would be the MX1 and MX2 districts. The MX stands for mixed use, and the number indicates whether it is less or more dense. As stated on the slide, both of these districts would allow for the types of small, multifamily housing that people said they wanted in the ward meetings and the survey. In the big picture, that is what the MX districts look like. They are further toward the interior of the city than the R2 district, and they are pretty close to the center. The tan color that's more on the outside is the MX1, and the darker color that's more on the inside is the MX2. As I said, they are not exactly an even swap with the districts that currently exist today. On the left is a map of the west side of the city, including Kelly Street and Amory Street down to Conant Street. On the right side is a map of the east side of the city, basically from Union Street to Belmont Street. This map shows the proposed zoning districts in color, and again, the MX1 is tan and the MX2 is brown. And you can see that the current districts are shown with the gray lines and letters, and it's sort of an alphabet soup right now. The proposed zoning ordinance, would simplify a lot of that, but it's hard to give an apples-to-apples comparison of all these districts. What I can tell you for sure is that the proposed area of the MX1 and MX2 would be 9.65% of the city, which is a fairly sizable area when you're talking about the center of the city. For a rough comparison, the current R3, B1, and C1 districts, which you saw on those prior 2 maps, which allow similar uses, would currently take up only a total of 4.73% of the city. There's a lot of information about the details of these districts and all of the districts on the website, including where they are located, and as shown here, the 2-page summaries, what types of buildings and uses are allowed in each district. This is the summary of the MX1 district, and it says that property can have up to 4 dwelling units on it with the appropriate lot area, so it allows for duplexes, triple-deckers, and small apartment buildings that people said they wanted to allow to increase the housing supply. The MX2 district would allow for everything allowed in MX1, but it would enable up to 9 dwelling units on a property with the appropriate amount of lot area. So it would enable apartment buildings that are larger, but still not what most people would think of as a large apartment building because it would be capped at 9 units. In contrast, the current R3 district, which is where a lot of the MX2 would go, does not exactly have a cap on the number of units, so it's possible that someone could build a much larger apartment building in the same area, which would contradict what the people said they wanted. People wanted to limit where large apartment buildings could go, and the proposed zoning ordinance would do that with the MX1 and MX2. It would make it a little easier to get up to 9, but it would put a cap at 9, so you would maintain the scale in these areas. That's actually better than what is going on now. Going back to this slide for a minute, I want to focus on the idea of where people said that they are comfortable with larger scale residential buildings. The comments from the ward meetings and the responses from the survey made clear that many people did not want to see large-scale apartment buildings in some neighborhoods where none exist now. However, there were also plenty of comments about how larger-scale residential is fine in areas that do have it now. There were multiple questions that asked this on the survey, including one which asked how people felt about there being a range of different housing types, including large housing options. As I pointed out, geography matters. There are places in the city where people are more comfortable with larger scale residential, and not surprisingly, those places tend to be where there are already larger scale buildings. These 2 maps show the areas of the city that currently or would allow for large apartment buildings. On the left is a map of the current districts that allow for large apartment buildings. They cover about 18.3% of the city's land area. And on the right is a map showing the proposed districts that would allow for large apartment buildings. They cover 26.36% of the city's land area. So it's definitely an increase, although what's more important really than quantity is quality, meaning let's look at where these larger apartment buildings could be built. This map shows the proposed zoning districts in color with the current zoning lines and labels on top. If I zoom into the middle, this shows the center of the city with the west side on the left of the map and the downtown in purple near the middle. Again, the colored districts are the proposed zoning districts that would allow large apartment buildings, and the gray lines are the current zoning along with the labels. What I want to bring your attention to are the 2 large areas where there are gray outlines but no color. On the west side, that is areas around Rimmon Street, Dubuque Street, Kelly Street, and Amory Street. On the east side, that is areas around Beach Street, Maple Street, and Lincoln Streets. These areas currently allow for large-scale apartment buildings with adequate land area, and the proposed zoning ordinance would pull that back so that large apartment buildings could not be built there. The reason for that is that people in these areas, like wards 4 and 7 and 11, told us that large apartments didn't really fit in. They were okay with smaller scale residential, but not as much with larger scale. They also said that parking is a real problem for them, and considering the tight nature of these streets, they didn't think that the streets could handle much more on-street parking. So, as I said before, the goal with areas like this is to make it a little easier to build small, but a little harder to build big. And that raises the question, if the proposed zoning ordinance would shrink some areas where large apartment buildings could be constructed, how would it go from 18.3% to 26.36%? And most of the difference is here in the northwestern part of the city. That purple area on the right is not colored at all on the left because the current zoning there is what is called the Research Park District. That district intends for this land to become, as the name suggests, an office park for high-tech manufacturing and research. The city has owned that land off and on for decades now, and no deal could be made to attract the type of businesses that the city wanted. So to try a different approach and to address an urgent need for housing, the master plan proposed to allow for more uses, including residential, in this area. The first draft of the proposed zoning ordinance that was published last year followed the guidance of the master plan and proposed to make this new district called the Innovation District, which would still allow for large-scale manufacturing and office, but would also allow for large-scale housing. This new approach is already paying off as the Board of Mayor and Aldermen recently agreed to sell more than 80 acres of this land to a housing developer with a long track record here in Manchester. The sale would result in the construction of more than 400 dwelling units and more than 48,000 square feet of commercial uses. So that's what I wanted to say about housing affordability. Let's next go to preservation of natural and historic areas. These were popular topics for both the community meetings and the survey, and the proposed zoning ordinance would do a number of things to address them. Let's start with the preservation of natural areas. As we saw from the survey, 94% of people said that it is important to them to preserve existing natural areas in Manchester. So the proposed zoning ordinance attempts to respond in the following ways. First, it would provide more protection to sensitive wetlands in the city. Today, Manchester has some of the least protections for wetlands in the state. We only require structures to stay 25 feet away from wetlands, and we allow impervious surfaces like driveways to go right up to the edge, and we allow grading and tree clearing right up to the edge as well. This is out of step with other municipalities, and we worked with the Conservation Commission to come up with something that was a little more protective while not being too burdensome. With the proposed zoning ordinance, all wetlands would need a minimum no-touch buffer of 10 feet. That means no tree clearing and no grading within 10 feet of the wetland. The current 25-foot setback for structures would stay as it is, but it would also include impervious surfaces, which is different from today. That was all in the first draft of the proposed zoning ordinance. With the second draft, there is additional protection that came up thanks to the steering committee. The second draft would now include a buffer of 50 feet where the industrial district or the B2 district are directly next to the conservation district. There are only a couple of places in the city where this is going to apply, and those are Nuts Pond and Pine Island Pond, but in those locations, it could help protect water quality. Second, we have added environmental protection to Lake Massabesic by reducing the maximum lot coverage near the lake. This is a map of the eastern part of the city where Lake Massabesic is located. The dotted area shown on the map is the Lake Massabesic Protection Overlay District, or LMPOD. And the point of the district is to provide some additional protection for the city's drinking supply by eliminating some of the uses that can be allowed there, but the number of businesses that aren't allowed there is fairly narrow, and there are still lots of other things that can pollute the lake. One of those is runoff from parking lots. And with the current zoning, there's a certain district in the LMPOD that allows large businesses to have a lot coverage of 75% of their land with impervious surfaces like parking lots, and that can lead to oils and other chemicals running off into the lake. So the proposed zoning ordinance would reduce the highest lot coverage allowed in the LMPOD from 75%, as it is today, to 60%. This would require more of each business's land to be grass or trees, and it would better protect the water quality of some of Manchester's most important natural resources. Third on the list is the Conservation District. This is a district that exists today. Here is a map of its current locations. The purpose of this district is to prohibit all development aside from agriculture. It is located only on parks and other land that the city owns and some land that is preserved with conservation easements. In other words, it is only located on land that is probably never going to get developed. And because of that, we eliminated this district in the first draft of the proposed zoning ordinance. We wanted to reduce the complexity of the regulations, and we felt that there was no need to keep a district that would really never be used. When we spoke to people at the community meetings last summer, though, we found that many people did not like the idea of eliminating the district. They liked the additional regulatory protection that the district created. So we're putting it back. We are adding a few areas as well, mostly city land, such as Pine Island Park, Stevens Pond, and Nuts Pond. The only private land we are adding to the Conservation District is some land next to Crystal Lake, and that is owned by the Crystal Lake Preservation Association. We asked them if they would want us to put their land in the Conservation District, and they said yes. Fourth, the proposed zoning ordinance would add a requirement for a wooded buffer and for open space with planned developments of 5 acres or more. For anyone who is not aware, a planned development is a parcel of land with 2 or more principal structures. In the downtown area, these can sometimes happen with just a couple of buildings, but more toward the outskirts of the city, they can be large developments with hundreds of dwelling units. And when developers apply to the planning board to build a few hundred units on what used to be forest, neighbors can reasonably be concerned about how it's going to impact the natural environment around them. So, to prevent complete clear-cutting of these larger parcels and to give neighbors some assurance that they will have some wooded buffer between them and the new development, the proposed zoning ordinance would require a 50-foot setback for all new planned developments. It would also require some additional open space with the planned development, depending on how many acres the proposal is. Okay, now let's talk about preservation of historic areas, and let's start with the historic area that we're all most familiar with, which is the mill yard. The mill yard is a special place not just for Manchester, but for all of New Hampshire, and it keeps its historical appearance in part because a city board known as the Heritage Commission reviews all building permits for exterior modifications to buildings. The current zoning for the mill yard is shown here in the area with angled stripes. That striping represents an overlay district, so there is a base district called the Amoskeag Mill Yard Mixed Use District, which is abbreviated AMX, and then there is an overlay district called the Amoskeag Mill Yard Historic District, which is abbreviated AMH. We're going to change the name of the base district and just call it the Mill Yard District, but that's not the main thing I want to point out. The main thing I want to mention is that there are historic buildings west of Elm Street and Canal Street that are adjacent to the mill yard now, that retain the, I'm sorry, I said west of Elm, I meant east of Elm and Canal, that are adjacent to the mill yard now, and they retain historic character of the mill yard, but they are not either in the current AMX district, which is the base district, or the AMX, which is the overlay that grants authority to the Heritage Commission review. No, I got it right the first time, I meant west, sorry. There are also buildings south of the mill yard with the same sort of historic character that are not in either zoning district. So the proposed zoning ordinance would expand the mill yard base district to include these areas. At the north, they are parts of West Brook Street, Langdon Street, Dow Street, Hollis Street, and Kidder Street, and at the south, they are essentially from Pleasant Street across Granite Street to WMUR or South Commercial Street. These are shown within the red dotted lines here on the proposed map. The important thing to note here is that while the mill yard base district would extend into these additional areas, the Amoskeag Historic Overlay District would not. That means that the rigorous requirements of the Heritage Commission would not apply to these newly designated areas, but they are important and they do add to the character of the city. And so the proposed zoning ordinance would require that these new areas going into the mill yard district meet some basic architectural requirements to preserve their historic character. The primary requirement for these areas would be that at least 75% of the surface area of a building's exterior walls would need to be faced with brick. This could be brick veneer, but the point would be to show that these areas are historical in nature. These requirements would apply to the entire mill yard, but those areas that would be in the historic district would have stricter standards anyway. The planning staff and the steering committee talked a lot about what historic protections would be appropriate for the Gaslight District. This is a fairly small area of a few blocks that has some historic significance, which was recently documented in a historic survey done for the Heritage Commission. The commission wrote to the steering committee and asked if they could add further historic protections for this area. After a fair amount of discussion with the committee, the result was the creation of the Gaslight Historic Overlay District. This new district would require property owners who want to modify buildings in the district to consult with the Heritage Commission. Unlike properties in the AMH or AMX, the Heritage Commission would not have regulatory authority. They would be able to make suggestions to property owners and collaborate with them, but they would not be able to mandate anything. This was seen as a good compromise to help bring the Heritage Commission into the process without being unduly burdensome on property owners. So that is what I wanted to say about the preservation of natural and historic areas. Let's go next to community character and design. And let's start with something that came up a lot in the comments about the survey, which is that buildings should fit in with existing neighborhoods. We already talked about one aspect of this, which is limitations on building sizes, and as we discussed with this map, there are areas of the city on both the west and east sides that have fairly dense street grids and a lot of older buildings that have small multifamilies, but the current zoning ordinance allows for larger apartment buildings with the right amount of land area. And the proposed zoning ordinance would eliminate some of the areas where large apartment buildings could be built. It would put a cap on the size of residential buildings so that they fit in better with these smaller buildings that are already there. Another difference from the current zoning ordinance is that the proposed zoning ordinance would have more tools for aesthetic regulation. I talked about this a fair amount in the presentation for the first draft, and there are a lot of resources about this on the website, but to describe it briefly, the proposed zoning ordinance would be a form-based code. This is a type of zoning ordinance that has additional ways of regulating building appearance. It can regulate the standard sorts of things like height and bulk and lot coverage, just like the ordinance does today, but it can also regulate windows and building materials and finer details that the current zoning ordinance does not. There are hundreds of municipalities in the country that have adopted form-based codes and some in New Hampshire as well, and there are all sorts of ways to write them. As with pretty much everything else, we have taken an incremental, middle-of-the-road sort of approach to adopting a form-based code. Here we are attempting to establish some basic minimum standards on appearance, and we are simply trying to write an ordinance that delivers on what the people of Manchester want. For the first draft, we knew that we should write a form-based code because the master plan said we should update our regulations and we should focus on the update to form and character of the buildings. And that is a form-based code. And more importantly, for the second draft, we got really strong responses about design. This is that question comparing the two buildings, and it was 99-1. It is clear that people prefer buildings with more architectural detail. The current zoning ordinance does not have the tools to distinguish between these two buildings, but the proposed zoning ordinance would. That's not to say that the proposed zoning ordinance would prohibit buildings like the one on the right entirely. There would definitely be places in the city where they are allowed. The proposed zoning ordinance would just be able to do a better job of preventing buildings like that with blank walls that are unappealing to most people from being constructed in places where people don't want them. This is another survey response from earlier, and again, the graph is not all that easy to read, but what it's saying is that people are much more comfortable with businesses locating near their homes if the businesses are required to blend in with their surroundings. So many of these topics overlap, and this is as much a small business question as a design question, but it clearly has design implications. So it would be reasonable for someone who lives in a quiet, single-family neighborhood to say, well, this aesthetic regulation is nice for commercial areas, I guess, but what does it have to do with my neighborhood? To that, I would say, even if you're nowhere near a commercial area, aesthetic regulation can still be a benefit for any new building that might show up near you. Let's talk about accessory dwelling units. These are separate dwelling units that are on the lot of a single-family house. They can be either attached or detached, and there has been a state law on the books for years now saying that every municipality with zoning, which is basically all of them, has to allow an ADU anywhere that it allows single-family homes. Manchester has actually allowed for them for longer than the state has mandated them, and we have always imposed some basic requirements on the ADU to make it match the house. Basically, we've said that the colors and materials and things like that need to match because we want the ADU to fit in with the neighborhood. We did that because we wanted to avoid this. This is a shipping container turned into an ADU. People can buy plans for these on the internet, and there are all sorts of pictures of people doing this. In Manchester, we wanted to impose requirements to prevent this and things like it, which we did, but we're actually not allowed to do that anymore because the state legislature just passed House Bill 557. That bill, which is already in effect, says that aesthetic standards cannot be applied to an ADU if they are not applied to a house. The current zoning ordinance does not apply aesthetic standards to houses, so pursuant to HB 557, we cannot impose aesthetic requirements on ADUs anymore. And that means that someone could have a house in a neighborhood that is surrounded by nice traditional homes and put down something that is out of character for the neighborhood. And with the proposed zoning ordinance, though, we have aesthetic requirements for houses. It's nothing fancy. We don't have highly elaborate standards, but they do require some basic things like a pitched roof, a certain amount of windows per wall area, and some other things that can help to prevent buildings that look like this. And instead, we can require buildings that are more like this. Okay, I also want to cover landscaping, especially for commercial uses in parking lots. As the result of this question shows, people care a lot about landscaping. So the proposed zoning ordinance has additional landscaping standards that go beyond what the current zoning ordinance has. The current zoning ordinance doesn't really get into much detail that could distinguish between a nicely landscaped median and a dirt strip, and we made the landscaping requirements a little more clear. I just want to briefly mention code enforcement and property maintenance because this came up a fair amount in some ward meetings. We are quite responsive to code enforcement complaints, usually going out the same day we get one. That actually just happened today. A complaint came in to me at 8 a.m. and we were at the property within a couple of hours. So our code enforcement officers are excellent, but we have limited tools. There are some situations that zoning just doesn't address right now. What we can do, though, is try to add some language to the proposed zoning ordinance that gives us a little more authority. Zoning has limitations, but we tried to think creatively, and we are adding language for both the storage of excess junk on properties and automobile repair in residential neighborhoods. These are fine lines because we don't want to penalize someone for storing some lumber on their yard or for a few weeks or for doing a little work on their car, but we do want to be able to put a stop to nuisances. Okay, so now let's go on to small businesses. The first item to discuss is that people said that they want more neighborhood-scale businesses in easy reach, but in a way that is gradual and just expands out from current commercial areas. An example is the response to this question, which asked whether respondents would support or oppose allowing small-scale businesses such as coffee shops and convenience stores and salons in select residential neighborhoods that are located close to commercial areas. The zoning ordinance's response to this is to create two new districts called the MX1 and MX2. These are meant to gradually allow for the introduction of more neighborhood-scale businesses in areas that already have a little more commercial or are near commercial. As I said earlier, the details of how these districts work are on the website, but each district would allow only a limited number of non-residential uses that are appropriate to be near residential uses. This would be things like barbershops and retail. The MX1 district would be the less intense of the two districts, and it would require a conditional use permit from the planning board before any business could occupy a building. That would allow the board a chance to decide if the business is appropriate, and it would require notice to abutting landowners. Also for the MX1, the locations of businesses could only be on corner lots and only on specific streets. So this is the most gradual way we could think of to just allow a few businesses here and there. The MX2 district would have the same limitations on the size of businesses at 3,000 square feet and the use of businesses as only those that are appropriate for neighborhoods. There would be no requirement for a conditional use permit from the planning board except for restaurants, and as those can be noisy and have hours that could be incompatible with nearby uses. It is notable, though, that any new construction of a business anywhere in the city would require site plan approval from the planning board, so that would also be true in the MX2. Those MX districts are really the main way that businesses would be allowed near residential with the proposed zoning ordinance in a way that they are not today. The other thing that people said that I want to discuss is that small businesses near residential areas should conform to neighborhood scale and appearance. This is basically the same thing that we just discussed with community character, so I don't want to go over it again in too much detail, but I do want to note that because the proposed zoning ordinance has the tools of a form-based code, we can specify building types. So the proposed zoning ordinance can have some aesthetic control of the form of buildings that go into districts like the MX1 and MX2. And I don't want to suggest that these requirements are overly burdensome. The goal is to establish basic minimum requirements. Again, though, when people say that they would prefer that businesses fit in with current neighborhoods, we try to implement that. Okay, so now let's discuss parking. We know that people care a lot about parking. We know that there are areas of the city where it is especially problematic toward the center of the city on both the west and east sides. We take people's concerns about parking seriously, and since the publication of the first draft, we have probably spent more time on parking than on any other topic. I know that the presentation has been quite long, so I don't want to bore you with too much information, but let me address a couple of points. One of the first things we did was rethink the current parking regulations to try to find ways that we could comfortably allow for more parking spaces on the same amount of land, especially for smaller residential uses. This could help to reduce the reliance on street parking. So we diagrammed how we might be able to allow for a few additional parking spaces with residential buildings of different sizes so that we could find ways to get cars off the street parking while also maintaining enough landscaping and building space. We also worked with a member of the steering committee who is a land surveyor and does these sorts of layouts frequently. He was great at telling us a number of things about our ordinance that have resulted in lost parking for his clients. One of the things that we wanted to reconsider was alleys. The west side and the east side close to downtown are full of alleys, and they provide a way for people to park closely to one another, but the current zoning ordinance has some requirements for any residential building of more than 2 dwelling units to have a 10-foot landscape buffer around it. We know that there are lots of 3 families out there without this landscaping, and at least off the alleys, it's fine. There's no need to require that. We really rethought parking requirements for 1, 2, and 3 family dwellings in a lot of ways, for instance, with tandem parking. That is parking in which one car can block another car in. The current zoning ordinance does not allow it, but we know it's already happening. We tried to think about how the zoning ordinance could allow it without it becoming a problem. We think that this is a good example of where it's done right. Here you have parking spaces that are clearly long enough for 2 cars, and you have each double parking space marked with the unit number so that if someone blocks you in, it's someone you live with. This sort of thing is going on now, despite it being prohibited, so we figured that the ordinance should allow it as much as possible so that it can absorb cars from street parking. Another requirement of the current zoning ordinance that is often not followed is the setback from structures of 4 feet. As shown in this picture, people park closer to sheds and buildings than 4 feet, and it helps them fit their cars on their lots. For small residential uses, this is not a problem, so the proposed zoning ordinance would reduce that requirement. There are other design rules that would be changed, and I don't want to bore you with all of them, but the point is that small-scale residential uses should be allowed to park in tighter ways because these are not public buildings where people are coming and going all the time, and they shouldn't be subject to the same standards. As I said earlier, for larger parking lots, there are pretty firm standards about safety and aesthetics. People said that they like nicely landscaped lots, and so we got the message. Just quickly, I want to mention that we spent a lot of time on accessible parking. In fact, we spoke with people at the New England ADA Center and the U.S. Department of Justice and the state of New Hampshire about accessibility requirements because, again, going back to smaller residential buildings, our current zoning ordinance has some pretty stringent standards for requiring accessible parking spaces for buildings like triple-deckers. This can get a little bit over the top because the zoning ordinance can require an ADA parking space for an entirely non-accessible triple-decker, and so if people are following the rules, they need to set aside a parking space that no one is going to use. And so with a lot of research, we figured out a way to not require that, and we freed up parking space on some lots. This is just a small thing in the context of this presentation, but it took us a long time to figure out because these laws are quite complicated and we wanted to get them right. Let's talk about parking requirements for a minute. Like most zoning ordinances, the current ordinance mandates the number of parking spaces that a residential or a non-residential use are required to have on their lot, and the proposed zoning ordinance would do the same thing. The first draft proposed parking reductions for a number of uses from what they are today, but the comments and survey results that we got from Manchester citizens prompted us to rethink that a little. As we said earlier, the majority of people said for both residential and non-residential uses that they like parking so much that they would prioritize it over allowing residential or non-residential uses to have more floor area. There were, though, a significant number of people who felt differently. And so we got to work thinking about how to rethink parking regulations. We went so far as to buy a subscription to the Institute of Transportation Engineers Parking Generation Manual, which gave us nationwide data about thousands of parking studies. We spent a fair amount of time coming up with different ideas, and we were bringing most of the parking requirements back to what they are in the current ordinance, but then the law changed. Senate Bill 284 was just signed into law. It says that municipalities may not require more than 1 parking space per dwelling unit. So any thought that we had given to how we might require more parking spaces for residential units and the response that people gave us to this question about required parking for residential units is something we can't consider. The proposed zoning ordinance will, of course, comply with the law, and it will only require 1 parking space per residential unit. Our work with non-residential units is still applicable, though, so we will be bringing some of those standards back to the current zoning ordinance, although the second draft does reduce the requirements for some uses like manufacturing because those were just too high. There's more we could discuss about parking, but considering how much we've already discussed, let's go on to signs. This is actually fairly simple to explain. People want to keep big freestanding signs and billboards and EMCs limited to only the most commercial places, not including downtown and the mill yard, so that's what we did. I would just add that we are taking a form-based approach to signs as well as buildings so we can have a little more control over what they look like. Regarding murals, we know that people like them, so the proposed zoning ordinance would allow them in all districts aside from the residential districts and the MX1. Let's just spend a couple of minutes talking about the plan for how the proposed zoning ordinance can be adopted. This is the last section of the presentation. A zoning ordinance is legislation, and the Board of Mayor and Aldermen are the legislative body for the City of Manchester, so they are the ones with the authority to adopt the proposed zoning ordinance. They are therefore an integral part of the zoning process, and the aldermen have been involved with this process since the beginning. They went to the ward meetings that were held last summer, and they received copies of the reports from the University of New Hampshire about what their constituents said. 2 representatives from UNH and I presented the findings to the aldermen earlier this year, and 2 members of the aldermanic board are on the zoning ordinance steering committee, so they have participated especially a great deal in this process. Additionally, the planning staff invited all of the aldermen to meet with us last month to talk about the second draft, and we had many good discussions as a result. And in addition to all of that, we have held many informal discussions about zoning with the aldermen, and a lot of important edits to the second draft happened because of those discussions. So the aldermen have already played an essential role with the zoning ordinance even before they vote on it. And before the proposed zoning ordinance is formally submitted to them, though, it is important for the public to have an opportunity to review the second draft. And that is why it is being published tonight, and it will not be formally submitted to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen until October 7th, which is exactly 60 days from now. We want there to be enough time for people to read the document and get any questions or comments to us that they want. Now, documents need to get to the board a little more than a week before they meet, and planning staff would want some time to review them before making any edits. So if you are interested in reading the second draft and making comments, the sooner you could get us those, the better. If you could get them to us in the next month or so, that would be great, but we could absolutely look at comments that come to us by the middle of September. Any review and comment that occurs during that time is in addition to the requirements of state law. The law simply requires a 10-day notice before a public hearing and for the text to be on file for inspection. We have gone well beyond what the law requires throughout this process, and so of course, we will continue to do that and provide far more than 10 days to review the second draft starting today. The comment period starting today and going through September is simply something that we on the planning staff want to do to give people more time to read the document. The official 10-day period will happen, though, as will the public hearing. The dates for those will be up to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen ultimately. It is possible that the public hearing could be at the second board meeting in October, which would be the 21st, or it could be at the board meeting in November, which would be the 18th. Please refer to the board's agendas, which are posted on the city's website. Depending on when the public hearing is held, the vote that the board takes on the ordinance could be on December 2nd, or it could be on December 16th. Either way, the goal is to allow the Board of Mayor and Aldermen to vote on the proposed zoning ordinance this year. As you may know, the aldermen serve for 2 years before being reelected, and there is an election this November, and there will be different members on the board next year. We think it is important to bring this zoning ordinance to this group of board members to put their stamp on it, as they have spent so much time with it. If the aldermen were to adopt the zoning ordinance, implementation would begin March 1st. We want to give people time to become familiar with the ordinance, and we want to create all of the proper forms and other administrative requirements. As I said earlier, please go to our website to find a copy of the proposed zoning ordinance. And again, that website is up on the screen, as is the email address to contact the planning staff with any questions or comments. I want to sincerely thank you for sitting through this lengthy presentation and for your interest in zoning. Manchester is such a wonderful place to work, and it is because of the dedicated people like you who would sit and watch a presentation like this. And so if you haven't had enough of zoning, the planning staff are here and happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much. And with that, I think we're done.
I have a question.
Great. Okay.
We can do it like after or now. I don't know how you plan to do it.
If you want to just talk one-on-one, that's fine with me.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone.